Welcome to our week on urban geography, an exciting, very pertinent topic to look at the world of cities around us. To start off, thinking about urbanization through time, we can see that today just over half, or 54% of human beings live in cities. By the year 2050, the UN estimates that this figure will stand at 70%. So 2007 roughly marked a very interesting point in human history where the number surpassed 50% of people living in cities. It's a huge shift in the trajectory and situation of humanity. Here we see the urbanized population of the world, which countries have some of the highest percentages, which have some of the lowest. In particular, Ethiopia, Mali, parts of Central Asia as well, Uzbekistan, and then also in the Southwest Pacific, Papua New Guinea, at a very small percentage of urbanized population, in contrast to over 80% in North America, France, Australia. The first true cities, we can begin to look at how urban settlements dating back to around 4000 BCE in Mesopotamia were without a doubt true cities, archaeologists have shown. Mesopotamian cities covered half to 2 square miles, with populations rarely exceeding 30,000. Densities within these cities could easily reach 10,000 people per square mile, which is comparable to the densities in many contemporary cities. So it's pretty interesting to think about 6,000 years ago having similar urban densities as today in Oakland. Not all city dwellers, though, were involved in obtaining food. There's a qualitative difference compared to farm villages. So versus most of these settlements of 6,000 years ago being still villages, urbanized centers represented a large shift, a significant difference in the lack of most people needing to obtain food within the city. So here we have a map of early Mesopotamian and Egyptian cities. We can begin to see the proximity to rivers, especially to coastlines. Very fascinating geography portrayed here in Mesopotamia. Along those lines, the required elements for the development of cities, we can think of two in particular. The creation of an agricultural surplus, so more food being produced than was able to be used. And then also the development of a stratified social system, so different layers of society, most classically thought of as different class systems, class layers, amount of wealth. But in different societies, this became stratified based on different aspects, other different aspects as well, such as professions and trades. The agricultural surplus is a very important point because early cities were especially important for protecting surpluses of food, to be able to withstand through dormant periods between seasons, and protect those stores of food against raiding armies. Urban hearth areas refers to these first cities throughout the world and how they were congregated in certain regions. For instance, the Nile River Valley, which we just saw, Pakistan's Indus River, the Yellow River of China, the Huanghe, Mesoamerica as well, and importantly, the Andean highlands and coast of Peru. These are all thought of as the ancient urban hearth areas. Hearth we can think of as a central point of the hearth in homes with fireplaces. The hearth areas, urban hearth areas of the world, were the places where the first cities developed. And some of them were quite cosmological cities in that they are arranged spatially according to religious principles. So in the text, there's a great picture of the highland Andean cities and how they were aligned with the sun and moon. This is often referred to as axis mundi, the symbolic center of cosmological cities. sometimes demarcated by a large vertical structure. Here we have a map of these original 6 urban hearth areas dating back to as early as 5000 BCE, so over 7,000 years ago. And that these ongoing discoveries suggest how urban life appeared earlier in each of these hearths, and that there are probably other hearth areas, for example, West Africa. And we can see the World Heritage Site on the Great Zimbabwe National Monument in Chapter 1. That's a great overview of that area. Importantly then, jumping forward to just a few centuries ago, cities in the Industrial Revolution, we can begin to see how the connection of agricultural innovations throughout millennia with the rise of cities. This was referred to as the first urban revolution. The second one being how societies in Western Europe and later in North America became industrialized. First with the advancement of technologies such as mills and primitive factories becoming more and more manufacturing centers. Through this, capitalism reshaped the cities of Western Europe beginning in the mid-16th century through the mid-18th century. That capitalist mentality of private ownership, this introduced the notion of urban land as a source of income. Residential areas became segregated by economic class, and the place of work then became spatially distinct from the home. It's a big shift with early cities, early Industrial Revolution cities. You have a picture of modern day Pittsburgh, exemplifying the extreme importance of rivers and waterways to the development of cities from early on, 7,000 years ago, up through currently to today for transportation and trade, also serving for early food sources. And here we see how Pittsburgh's commercial center is located at the juncture, the Monongahela and the Allegheny rivers, western Pennsylvania. Next, through the lens of mobility, we can look at the causes of modern urbanization, showing great forms of mobility, such as natural population increase, rural to urban migrations, the most significant form currently, and also urban to urban migration, the rise of the quaternary sector. You can see lots of urban to urban migration as well, but the focus here is really on rural to urban migration. This happened in the US, especially in the 19th century, Chicago being a great example, but more and more in the 20th century with Asian cities such as Tokyo and Mumbai. And currently about 4/5 of the world's future urban growth will result from rural to urban migration in Asia and Africa. China is a stunning example of this, with over 100 cities of over 1 million people now. Rural to urban migration happening rapidly there, year after year. Cities can also increase in size because the conditions in the countryside are dismal, and many jobs in developing cities are low skilled and low paying with harsh working conditions. Rural to urban migrants are often either unemployed or get jobs that can barely provide a decent living. This causes a lot of tough social conditions within cities. Here you have a map of the world's megalopoli, or that's the plural form of megalopolis. These are megacities, in some cases over 30 million people, such as Tokyo, Yokohama, but also the Boswash corridor, the eastern US, from Boston down to Washington, similarly surrounding Mexico City, and Delhi as well in India. These are some of the largest population centers in the world, with well over 20 million people. Beijing quickly advancing on this, as well as Shanghai. Through the lens of globalization, we can look at urbanization and cities, especially these top 30 cities around the world here, showing massive amounts of wealth. The determining factors as global city status being business activity, human capital, information exchange. You can think of the internet and stock exchanges, political engagement, oftentimes capital, or if not a major economic powerhouse of these respective countries and in international trade, and as well as a global city based on cultural experience. So Los Angeles is importance within the US for the cultural experience based on Hollywood, Montreal within Canada, strong French-Canadian capital there. Cities such as Amsterdam as well, strong cultural presence within Europe. Next, to look at the globalization of urban poverty. Very important to consider how around the world unemployment, deterioration of housing and urban infrastructure, other manifestations of poverty in urban landscapes are quite visible. Most global cities have pockets of both extreme wealth as well as its opposite, extreme poverty. And so with this, he highlights the importance of shanty towns again. This overwhelming pressure for low-rent housing and yeah, the sometimes squalid conditions that can accompany those places. Along those lines, how this interaction with the natural environment, we can look at the lens of nature culture to see how urban wealth and brings to mind implications on the climate in cities. Cities alter virtually all aspects of local weather and climate, and temperatures are higher in cities, which can also be quite dangerous, if not deadly, for shanty towns, whether it be based on heat or also then flooding as well. And this it can be referred to as the urban heat island, where a mass of warm air is generated and retained by urban buildings, including blacktop as well. Human activities sits over the city, causes urban temperatures to be greater than surrounding areas. So here we see a graph how that's mapped out with literal temperatures. How in cities you can have 20 degrees Fahrenheit higher temperatures compared to the surrounding rural areas. You can also see how green walls, green roofs, and parklands can absorb heat and help cool the urban atmosphere. This really highlights the importance of having green space within cities and around cities, and new technologies that are used even on vertical buildings, growing greenhouses vertically on buildings to help cool not only the buildings but the overall urban environment. Cities are extremely environmentally vulnerable. Urbanization generates its own set of environmental impacts. It's what's known as the urban footprint. And environmental effects of increasing urbanization can spread beyond the immediate stress caused by higher concentrations of population. So growing demand for things like different foods can impact areas far from urban centers. This is exemplified by the desert suburb here, a very common landscape throughout the American West, in particular Las Vegas, not too dissimilar from heading east out of the San Francisco Bay Area. Other parts of even Atlanta as well would show very similar building pattern. High cost on the urban transportation network, urban ecology, and surrounding rural area ecology as well. Along these lines, it's interesting to point out how different countries and continents fare in planning for the climate change that can accompany such urban transformations and suburban transformations. You'll notice how low the US is on this list, under 60% of cities planning for climate change, and this is already coming back to harm US cities. In contrast to other developed nations, we could see Canada well over 90% of its cities planning for climate change. On the cultural landscape note, we can look at gentrification, the displacement of lower income residents, economic activities by higher income residents and activities. And this picture sums this up well from Puerto Madero in Buenos Aires. Expensive dock facilities have been converted to private entrepreneurs into clubs, restaurants. Displaced becomes the local poor residents. So if you have questions about this, please post below and we can continue these talks. Thanks.